So in today's lesson we're going to continue looking at cells and cell membranes, but this time we're going to focus on the cellular environment. What is surrounding cells? Now there are three key fluids involved in the cellular environment. There is the internal environment, the external environment, and the extracellular fluid. Now, which fluid is which name we give to it, depends on the type of organism that we're looking at. So on the left-hand side here, I've already drawn the diagram for a prokaryote. Now, prokaryotes don't have an internal environment. Instead, they have their external environment, which is their extracellular fluid, their ECF. And then they have their cytoplasm. So the ECF, regardless of being prokaryotic or eukaryotic, is the fluid that is in direct contact with the cells. Because the prokaryote is unicellular, it only has the one possible situation here, which is that the ECF and the external environment are the same thing. There is no internal environment because they are a single cell. Whereas for many eukaryotes who are multicellular, their external environment is the environment that surrounds their cells, that surrounds their entire body. So here I've got just a quick diagram of a tree, and you can see that we've got this external environment surrounding the tree. We have our plant cell indicated right in the middle, obviously nowhere near to scale, and these red sort of hashes around it represent the internal environment, and this is the extracellular fluid, this is the ECF. So for eukaryotes, we have an internal environment which is the same as the extracellular fluid, and then we have the cytoplasm within the cells themselves. So for eukaryotes or for multicellular organisms, the extracellular fluid and internal environment are the same thing because that's what's in contact with the cell wall or with the cell membrane. Exerting some kind of control over the extracellular fluid, whether it's your external environment or internal environment, is critical to survival. So the extracellular fluid is what's in direct contact with the cell. The extracellular fluid is predominantly water. There are some dissolved solids, so there's salts and there's sugars, and there will be proteins floating around in there if you're involved in a living cell. Because the membrane is permeable to water, water can get in and get out, and anything that's able to be dissolved in fats is also able to get in and get out, and we'll go through the reasons why. For now, just accept that that's true, but anything that's dissolved, that can dissolve in fat, and very, very small particles like gas molecules, carbon dioxide and water, can pass very easily across the membrane. Because of this permeability, how we control the extracellular fluid, what it's made up of, is very important for survival. If there's a toxin in there, then it's very likely that that toxin is going to come into contact with the cell membrane and possibly enter into the cell. So for unicellular organisms, exerting this control is incredibly difficult. Because it's their external environment, and the external environment compared to the size of the cell is incredibly massive, exerting any kind of control over that is incredibly difficult. So they do so in small ways. What we talked about earlier with prokaryotes living in colonies, that's a very important way for them to do that. They can live in large colonies or large groups of bacteria, and they can actually develop this small control over at least their immediate environment. And for multicellular organisms, we have entire structures dedicated to the control, entire organ systems dedicated to the control of our extracellular fluid. For us, for the most part, extracellular fluid is going to be the fluid in between our tissues and the fluid in our blood, the plasma in our blood. And we have a huge number of different organs and organ systems that are directly involved in maintaining them. So when we're looking at external and internal environment, external environment is the fluid around a cell or organism is exposed to. It can be simplified as the extracellular fluid for unicellular organisms, or for multicellular organisms, this is going to be our habitat, our environment. Because we have this outer layer as multicellular organisms, we have this very clear barrier between our environment or our external environment and our internal environment. Effectively, what this ends up meaning is that our internal environment behaves independently of the external environment. Now, that's not always the case. We know that when it's hot outside, our body responds to that, that's actually a response to keep our internal environment at a stable level so that we can actually maintain this control over our internal environment. So we do react to the external environment, but we do so in order to control that extracellular fluid or our internal environment. When we're exerting internal control, so this is now looking very much at multicellular organisms, we give it an overarching term. We call it homeostasis. So it's basically the ability or the behavior of a cell or an organism to keep something, anything, within certain boundaries, to keep it static. That's what the stasis part means. Now, because we have a limited amount of energy, we have a limited amount of resources, we tend to focus, our bodies will focus on specific characteristics to keep under control, specific conditions. So these will be things like concentration of salts. So we do that by maintaining hydration, so that when our kidneys process urine, we make sure that we can reabsorb as much salts as we possibly can. We have a temperature monitoring system in our brains that makes us sweat when we're too hot and makes us shiver when we're too cold. We make sure that our nutrient levels are correct. So we have nervous systems and we have hormone systems in our body that tell us when we're hungry so that we eat when we need to. And then we also have this monitoring of pH. And our pH monitoring is particularly driven by breathing. If we're exercising, our pH levels will decrease, our blood will become more acidic, and we'll start to breathe more rapidly so that we're getting rid of this acidic nature of our blood. So we're bringing it back to a more controlled level. Now, this control is so important, and in fact, a change as small as 5%, for example, temperature, if you go from 38 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius, which represents roughly a 5% change, that can kill you. It can kill you in a matter of minutes or hours. So this is a very, very important feature. When we're looking now at exchange, and we're going to focus quite a lot on this exchange from now, organisms need to exchange materials with their environment. We have to. There's requirements we looked at earlier. We have our energy requirements, our nutrient requirements, and our waste requirements. We must be able to take in and get rid of certain chemicals. In larger organisms, this exchange is quite difficult because we have to go from much longer distances. When we consume something, it needs to go from our mouth all the way through to our bodies, into our intestines so that we can absorb it. Then it passes through the remainder of our intestine so that we can get rid of the unneeded fecal waste. The other thing that we need to consider as well is because we are so large, our efficiency in this exchange is relatively low. And we'll talk later on about how cell size relates to that. Bigger cells, bigger organisms have a much lower efficiency. So we have this real problem of directing that exchange. How can we actually make sure that exchange is as efficient as it possibly can? Keeping in mind those limited resources. If we have such limited resources, it's going to be far more difficult to move things if we're allowed to remain inefficient. So our body has developed efficiencies to get around that. Now, so it brings us to the end of our lesson for this particular video. Hopefully you've got a good idea of what's going on here. Can I remind you though that you should be writing down questions and recording anything that you need to, bringing things to class, bringing ideas and thoughts to class.